Mamoru Oshii's Angel's Egg may very well be one of the most remarkable documents of film art ever composed, a bastion of the animated form generally, of which live action film is, of course, simply one component of. An apotheosis of anime ambitions, rooted in the science fiction preoccupations of many major anime works of that era, a vague continuation of Osamu Tezuka's either surrealist or otherwise symbolic manga classics, as in Hinotori Hu Hen, for instance, and a stream of consciousness manifestation exploring evidently Christian images, a faith which Oshii professed a certain devoutness toward. His later, more famous and regarded Ghost in the Shell 1995 has been on occasion noted for this, including an utterly incredible still, wherein the missile, which Batu attempts to shield Motoko from, is briefly depicted as an Abrahamic angel. A film which often Noel Oakeshott and I would claim as being among the finest sires of the medium's greatest auteurs, and Oshii was an artist whom he elevated very highly amongst the pantheon, and he wholly deserves to be remembered as not just one of the greatest directors of animated films, but one of the finest directors of world cinema, period. When considering the anime films features released up to and including the 1980s, Angel's Egg stands tall amongst them, competing with major regularly cited classics such as Akira, Grave of the Fireflies, the Gundam films from Tomino, Royal Space Force, The Wings of Honeomes, the earlier films of Hayao Miyazaki, Oshii's own Pat Labor the movie, Barefoot Gen, Space Adventure Cobra, and Golgo 13, both from Osamu Tezuka, and all those Doraemon films. What Angel's Egg has to offer is the most visceral animation, impactful imagery, and immersive atmosphere. It is true some may prefer the bold humanism which is aspired toward in, say, Takahata's Grave of the Fireflies, or one of those energetic Miyazaki classics, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, My Neighbor Totoro, Kiki's Delivery Service, or perhaps the sheer kinetic motion and revolutionary rush of Otomo's Akira. I myself may incline towards Akira. I am immensely fond of it and have been since I was an adolescent. A predictable story for possibly a great number of us. I, however, have always firmly believed in the what some might refer to as surreal, symbolic, or otherwise non-narrative filmmakers and their ambitions to conjure entirely or predominantly visual experiences wherein our mental association of the presented images is enough of an enchanting interaction as the ordinarily narrative ventures which dominate most screenings across this globe. I do believe in the capacity of these films to invigorate and enrapture audiences, as I witnessed such a thing just this very morning, as a Sydney Film Festival retrospective screening of Oshii's Angel's Egg appeared to transfix and mystify the gathered attendees, perhaps unsure of what it may mean in a purely literal sense, yet utterly arrested by the overall display of ensnaring imagery, enthralled with the apparent mystery which densely pervades the flowing of scenes, and possibly a primordial recognition of inherently Christian or Judeo-Christian imagery, or possibly something even deeper throughout world cultures, that they can weave a narrative through the sometimes vague circumstances of the presented happenings. I do resolutely believe in the ability of such films to bewitch wider film audiences. Ultimately, an engaging, compelling arrangement of images, whether it is more traditionally narrative or a looser collation of a patterned subject, is still an engaging, compelling arrangement of images, regardless of whether it strictly adheres to the recognized formulas of beginning, middle, and end. There are several artists of this vein in the film medium across the decades, from Louis Buñuel, David Lynch, to John Cocteau, Alain Resnais, Louis Malle in 1975's Black Moon, Alejandro Jodorowsky, Jan Svankmajer, the legendary stop-motion animator Wizard, similar anime efforts from the likes of Rintaro, Yoshiyuki Tomino on odd occasions, or, most well-regarded, Satoshi Kon, René Lalloux's animation of Western Europe, similarly trippy and potentially reorienting to an uninitiated audience, the peculiar efforts of vibrant genius Guy Maddin. 2016's Seances may be one of the 5 most fascinating film projects of all time, in my personal opinion. The riveting imagination of the intimidating genius, that is, Raoul Ruiz, the K brothers, or a Japanese maverick such as Shinya Tsukamoto, who does operate in live action or has employed certain forms of animation in his best-known features, namely stop-motion animation, made possibly better than anyone else had done for '89's iconic masterpiece Tetsuo the Iron Man. Many of these filmmakers are dearly cherished into the present day, cultivating eager audiences via the expansive internet, as said audiences want something to change their world, to empower the prospective vastness of their imaginations, to assure themselves that there must be something more to the familiar, to the designated status quo, to the generally cited rules of how one ought to be usually doing things. There is a mild concern that works like Angel's Egg will get reduced in today's day and age into some chic that someone shares the knowledge or experience of on social media in order to gather some vacuous credibility. Although if it gets out there, that is inherently a very good thing, as Oshi's strife really ought to pay off as a great quest in semi-recent culture, and deserves major celebration as plausibly the finest thing this entire medium had to offer upon the year of its release. I would consider the other best films of 1985 to be Kurosawa's Ran, Terry Gilliam's Brazil, Huang Jianxin's The Black Cannon Incident, George Miller's Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, I'll get to you in a second, George Romero's Day of the Dead, L.M. Klimov's Come and See, Cloud Landsman's Shoah, Alexander Kluger's The Assault of the Present on the Rest of Time, one of the few here to really truly compete with Oshi's Angel's Egg. A film I used to claim was one of the 5 best ever made, for I also did so with Gilliam's Brazil for many a year, not that I feel as though I was at all mistaken in doing so. Stuart Gordon's Reanimator, maybe Deodato's grisly effort, Cut and Run, quite possibly Deodato's very best film overall. Lester's Commando, I'm getting a bit silly here, I know. Lamberto Bava's Demons, while we're being silly I suppose. Freddie Francis's The Doctor and the Devils is quite underrated and rather worthwhile. Jackie Chan's Police Story, of course. And maybe drop a mention for the surprisingly impressive, though contextually intensely tragic, that must always be mentioned when bringing this film up, Shin Sang-ok's peculiar yet incredibly admirable monster romp called Pulgasari. As you have just been insisted to strongly consider, 1985 was indeed an undeniably remarkable year in cinema and especially in retrospect, so it has me skeptical of any who ever claim that this medium is dead, as surely anyone who had in 1985 can be considered a certain fool looking back from today. Other Oshii films which are stellar, highly impressive classics include Dallos from 1983, a stirring little sci-fi project, the wild and colourful Urusei Yatsura 2, Beautiful Dreamer, the already mentioned, in a separate context of films, Patlabor the movie, but also it's considered superior, and I would quite concur, sequel from 1993, the much-adored Ghost in the Shell of 1995, though also its seminal, in my opinion, overall superior sequel, Ghost in the Shell 2 Innocence, which is sometimes considered on a par with the original in this current decade, and even one of the very best feature films of the overall 2000s. Talking Head of 1992, a major favourite of the aforementioned devotee Mr. Noel Oakeshott. The Skycrawlers of 2008 is pretty likeable for what it is, and then there is one bewitchingly genius feature titled The Red Spectacles, and its highly fascinating follow-up, I think it's a prequel of sorts, well, it's a bit slightly complicated I suppose, Stray Dog Kerberos Panzerkops of 1991. Oshii devised this particular riveting IP known as the Kerberos Saga, though did not direct all of its feature films. Hiroyuki Okiura directed his script, Oshii's script, for 1999's Jinro, The Wolf Brigade, and rather legendary Korean director Kim Ji-woon helmed a live-action work from 2018, which I believe was intended as a specific remake of that 99 Jinro Wolf Brigade effort. And there is several assorted media associated with this particular cross-media franchise. The point is, there is a lot of fascinating output from Oshii, and I consider him an insurmountable genius of this form, and a landmark artist even when considering all possible forms of it, and I hope to see the day when he is on a lot more persons' shortlists for the finest film directors in the history of filmmaking or animation, as perhaps ought to be just widely considered overall, as I thoroughly feel as though he deserves as much accolades as almost anyone who ever operated for the cinema, live action, or animated alike. I'll now open the floor to a potential discussion. Thank you very much and good night, friends, associates, strangers, all of you. God bless and be as well as you have ever known.